That's so true. All
Gotta get
right.
ready.
Get ready. Get ready. All right. Episode 14, Danielle
Yes.
of the Worksties. Before we get started, this episode is sponsored by socialjobs.com. A big shout out to Social Jobs for sponsoring the chaos of the Worksties. So, the Worksties. That's right. All right, we're going to talk today about change. I mean, I think that's the way to put it in a large bucket, whether it comes to the change that's happening in the world today, the change that you want to drive at work. Maybe there's buy in, maybe there's resistance, maybe it's technology or resource that you've already committed to something for the year, and then you want to midstream, it's not working. How do you drive that change and invoke that change? So we'll just talk about change in a lot of different ways because I feel like we've been going through it in every way, from work to life in general as we know it to whatever it is. I mean, change is inevitable and it's constant, and I'm tired of the change.
Well, I think it's one of those things where, the older you get, the more you realize how much changes all the time, right?
Yep.
And then it can feel like we're going through a tremendous amount of change today as opposed to other generations, but I don't know that that's really true. I think maybe we're probably just more have a greater sense that it's happening because of like social media and news on our phones and all these things that were so interconnected that, in years past, like our parents' generation and earlier, they weren't connected that way. So, you would, maybe get up, go to work, talk to people at work. You're not interacting with so many people on the same in the same way all the time. So I feel like we see it a lot more now, which makes it feel more intense, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it feels more rapid as well. When you think about how change is happening, how it's occurring, I feel like it's really fast. Where before some of the change felt a little slower and drawn out, but it's constantly pushed in front of us too. And we're able to change faster and evolve faster. I feel like as long as you have, if we're talking about, like let's say it's technology or whatever it might be, we have the ability, as long as you have the dollars or the resources or whatever you want to call it, to change a little bit faster at the same time. So I think we're also seeing some things at an accelerated pace. And I just wonder, just trying to think about some of the different things that have happened over the years and how it's ebb and flowed. Do we see more people adopting change, or do we see more people resisting change? Or do you think it's about even when you think about work and life? Or do you think it's about the same as it always has been? I feel like in some aspects, people have like tried to stay rooted and grounded and say, enough's enough. I don't want to change this. And it become a little bit more, I don't know if stubborn is the right word, but you have to convince change
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's faster and that we're doing more, but at the same time, I don't know. I don't know how you would measure it, right? Like, so it's all hypothetical. It's all based on what your own experience is. I feel like maybe younger generations are more accustomed to things changing all the time. So maybe they're just flowing with it better than we are. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, and also the older you get, the harder it is to change what you're doing or how you think about things. I consider myself like a, lifetime learner. I love to learn about new
Hmm.
things and love to kind of look in the past and kind of apply it to today and all of that. And so for me, I feel like that makes it a little easier in some ways, but I don't think not everybody thinks like I do, obviously. So, but I think also in what we do, we're kind of accustomed to things changing a lot too. If you worked in a different type of career, maybe that wouldn't look the same, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I
What do
think
you
that
think?
makes sense. I was talking to this lady on the plane last night, and this just came to me. I actually forgot about the conversation. I wish I remembered her name. I couldn't hear. Like when you have the airplane ears. Really nice lady. Anyway, she was
Yeah.
sitting next to me. And we were talking, and we happened to start talking about change, actually, and what's happening in the world with change and everything else. And kind of the conclusion that we came to. And she must have been, I don't know. She had to be somewhere in her late 60s, I would guess, if I were to guess her age. But it was interesting because we had kids about the same age at the same time. I think she just had them later in life. She had two daughters, so we were talking about that. But she was talking and saying, and we were just in general, like, we know there's some change that is needed. And it's interesting to see, like, when people are really resistant to that change, when they're accepting of change. But she was in the mindset, like talking about someone who's a little bit older or things like that. She was like, there's change that does need to happen and on board with different things. So I think it is. But she also, going back to the career piece of it, what she did for a living was work with different insurance companies to get them all set up. Right. So she was
Mhm.
new business startup. This is where everything should go. This is how you implement it. These are the people that you need to drive the business. So she was very much someone who evolved things and was
Mhm.
implementing change for people at the same time. So I think maybe it's, if to your point, like if we were doing something different, maybe it wouldn't be as easy to ebb
Right, and
and
that's
flow with change.
is in insurance, which you might not think of as being an evolving space, but it really is. I mean, there's a lot of change. Somebody was telling me the other day, I was talking to someone, and they were saying that, like, as far as in like the insurance space, pet insurance has become really big,
Oh yeah.
and that it's like a really growing market because a lot of younger people aren't having children. And so, like I know companies like Chewy have done really well because, they kind of target that particular area of business people who are, you know, having animals as opposed to children. But in like the insurance company I have, I was looking at the site and then they now offer pet insurance. So I could have home insurance, auto insurance, pet insurance, which just sort of seems sort of funny, but makes a lot of sense at the same time. So yeah, so I think anything, whereas you would think like insurance is kind of dry, not the most exciting area, but there
Hmm.
is a lot of change that can happen there too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so true. But thinking about that change aspect, how do you discern? Because there's people who drive change just to make change, right? Just because, I don't know, sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like if I think about the seats that we've sat in and there's this change coming on board, and I'm like, that's necessarily not going to solve the problems. It's going to probably exacerbate them, if
Distraction.
anything. But then there's
Yeah.
times when change, you're like, yes, it needs to happen and it's gonna, bring simplicity or efficiency or whatever else. And then also when we think about, we were just talking about how we've actually made recruiting so complicated with some of the changes that have been put in, where it was super simple before. We talked about this in episode 13, where it was just like, hey, how you doing? I have this job for you. Are you interested? Yes, great. Here you go. And off you go with the process. Again, making it seem more simple than it is, but now with everything that you have to do, it's more extensive from a process standpoint. I mean, there was paperwork and there
Right.
was things like that. It wasn't as easy because it wasn't electronic, but it was also easier and quicker to connect with someone and then follow up based on, I had always had like a little manual spreadsheet and tracker, and then systems came in play, which are great because now they're a database. But at the same time, when you think about some of these larger systems too, I won't say any names, but they don't even reserve up the talent. So if you're working with someone, you're working with them for the moment. And then once you stop working with them, you kind of lose that person. Where if, you had your tracker back in the day, I always knew where everybody stood and things like that. So,
Right. I was just thinking, I remember like back in the day when you'd have a tracker and maybe you placed a person, but there was a runner up candidate, a silver medalist, as we would like to say.
mhm,
And then maybe the person who accepted the role ended up not working out. And so the hiring manager might want to see that silver medalist again, see if they're still interested. And then you'd have to go back and find them and reconnect. And that's a lot harder to do if everybody's just in a database.
yeah. Well, unless you go back to that rack, right? I mean, if they're in the rack, then
That's what I'm saying.
yeah.
You'd have to go back to the rec, yeah.
Before you would just be like, dude, this was a job I was working for on my little tracker. I wanted to get that easy again in recruiting. When you think
Right.
about like that world where it was a little bit easier to manage, but you didn't have all the data that you needed. You didn't have, so there's pros and cons to each one of them. But how do we get back to like being able to press the easy button? I think agentic AI, when we think about that change and being able to be task based and it getting really smart. is where I see it kind of coming back, but I still think we're a little ways off from that. But that's going to take a lot of change to get to because of the way that the systems are set up today. So even if you have, let's talk about legacy systems. I mean, we all know the ones that sit out there, right? Your legacy systems would probably be your bullhorns and your work days and your Teleos and your I could keep going with all the your ISIMs and things like that. And then there's limitations to that system, but then how do you bolt on to make that process a lot easier? Which again, I think about the last instance that we did or that was implemented at Clover in upgrading to the next version of the system, which then broke a bunch of things that we saw coming. I knew it was going to break. I knew it was going to break. But how do
Well,
you
yeah, and I
avoid
think
that?
even if it didn't break, you should plan for it to break,
Yeah.
right? Just in case, right?
Hmm.
Nothing ever works out perfect.
Yeah. What was supposed to be the upgrade actually reduced efficiency across the board.
And we're like, wait,
So
who decided to do this? And really,
put them way before our time. That was decided way before my time. It's already wrote. Ship was sailing. Ship was already sailing. It was already, about to happen.
yeah,
But when I think about that,
we were
and
running down the dock trying to get it, but it
yeah,
wasn't happening.
yes, you need to change to upgrade it to be able to sustain, right? But then what are the impacts of that? What does it look like? And then when are you just pulling forward change for the sake of change when it would be better to stay on something that you have until you're truly ready to evolve to the next level and find that efficiency? I think that's a tough balance. That's a tough call to be able to do. You really have to understand like each little nuance within the system and how it works and how everything ties together. And I also believe that there's sometimes not enough time spent there to really understand that when you think about the
Well,
change
and
and
these
how it
types of changes do take a tremendous amount of resources, not just money, but time and effort. You know, you sometimes have a dedicated team that's just focused on that. Most companies either can't do that or they're not willing to put forward that kind of commitment. So yeah, that is definitely a big challenge.
yeah. I was meeting with someone, and this was, I want to say it was last week. I think it was last week that we were meeting, and someone who I've known for a really long time, or for a while, anyways. And what he said was a lot of people say they can do a lot of things, right? So when you look at all the options that are out there to be able to drive whatever it is, efficiency, change, things like that. But what truly is the right thing to be able to make it easy, right? Because you can implement something and create it, and you're going to be able to see more, but did it make it easier? I think when you think about that whole change aspect is really what it comes down to. Because if you're creating the visibility for the sake of efficiency, I don't know. I struggle with that one a little bit.
Yeah, I agree because when you say the word easy, I start thinking like, well, what does easy even mean?
Yeah.
Because it's going to mean something different for every company, right? So is it you're trying to be more efficient because you're trying to shorten the process or you trying to eliminate headcount? Like, what is your end goal? And then you have to kind of reverse engineer it to get to that point, right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like we've made recruiting so much more complicated, as we were just talking about with their trackers and everything. Back in the day, it was like you could just have like a stack of resumes and a phone, and you should theoretically be able to find and fill jobs, right? But now we've just made this huge process. Every company's is different. Some of it has to do with like the laws, and making sure that you're tracking certain parts of the process and all of that. But at the same time, it's just trying to make things so efficient that you've made it completely inefficient in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. It's just wild, in that sense of like how do we, yeah, to your point, like how do we get back to basics? And maybe that's where, maybe that should be more the focus because we've got so many technologies now that it should make things easier. And in a lot of ways, it just hasn't, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah, that's really true. And I think sometimes when I think about recruiting back in the day and sitting in that seat and doing it, then I recently just, was able to sit in the seat and watch, which was really interesting. Be like, "Ah, yeah, when I how the heck do we find people? Like, we have to go through a phone book. One, you put an ad in the paper. Two, they called you, right?
Right.
Inbound
Or you
calls,
did
outbound
open
calls,
offers.
email
Yeah.
was another way to be able to do it.
Faxes, resumes, faxed in.
Yeah, I guess there was some job boards back then you would go and you would source from, but we have access to so many people and so much talent at our fingertips. I think that also
Right.
becomes overwhelming at the same time. And there's so much access
Right.
the other way. So when you think about, all right, when you think about the candidate experience and then the recruiter experience or the company experience, whatever you want to say, recruiters sit in the seat in Canada. When you think about those two things, one, we've given more access to candidates to the recruiters into the company, right? And on the other side, recruiters have access and companies have access to more candidates, which in turn has created this whole big thing and this noise around that experience and that ghosting. Someone's not reaching out to me. Well, I have 1,000 people reaching out to me for this one job. It's hard to get back to everyone. Right.
Yeah.
So unless you do have some automation in there and put some change in it to reach people, but then now it becomes, well, it's not personal. It's an automated response. So you literally like, when you think about the change in recruiting and you think about all of those pieces, you can't win. Can you win? I think eventually you'll win, but it's going to take
Yeah, but I think
a lot of
it's
things
just
to
made
win.
it hard, you know, in
Yep.
so many ways. I think also it's made it harder for, I mean, I would imagine that if I was recruiting today, and maybe if I was recruiting for a company that I'd been with for a long time and they were making a lot of these changes, I'd probably be like, oh, here we go again. We're changing this again. And it would become frustrating. Whereas for people who are new to the industry, maybe they're just taking it more in stride. So it's almost like companies need to account for the people who've been there a long time.
Mhm.
If they've been successful at what they're doing, let them do what they've been doing. But is that possible because they've, you know what I mean? Like it makes it harder for people to kind of specialize in a certain way so that they can, like, well, this is what I do and how I do it and how I'm successful. And maybe they can mentor people who are coming up in the field, but I don't know that that's even really that possible anymore, right? I mean, there was people I remember when I first started recruiting who had been doing it for a long time, who I was like, oh, how do you do this? Like they would share, their insight or what they would do and how they would approach things. And I'm not sure if that's really the case today, unless you have somebody who's an independent recruiter or working at a boutique agency where they have to be much more in control of the whole process.
Yeah, if I think about kind of the kind of experience going through with an executive recruiter and then just a regular experience with a company recruiter, I feel like it was a very different
Yeah,
experience, like even from updates and things of that nature and preparing for an interview. I mean, there's some large companies where someone would just call you and be like, hey, this is the job. Are you interested? They might ask you a few screening questions. They were nervous. It was really interesting, some of the companies, because they're recruiting companies, but the recruiter, I think when they're talking to someone that has a lot of experience on the other line, they get a little bit
right,
nervous, which is so interesting to me. But then when you have someone who is more kind of that, executive recruiter that's used to dealing with people with a lot of experience and they're able to prep, they know the information. And I'll never forget the one person that I was talking to that said to me, well, I don't know. I just pass the information along the hiring manager and they make a decision. I was like, you have to own that as a
yeah.
recruiter. Like you
Not
have
not a
to
great
own
answer.
you're selling the candidate or you're having a candidate conversation and be like, this is why I think this person's a good fit. It's not just to pass the resume along, but that's how they were doing it. So, yeah. But I think when it comes to change, like even thinking about, job board contracts every year, we had to negotiate and renew those. And then during the year, someone would come to us. Let's say it's a new, I don't know, new resource, new whatever you want to say, and we really wanted to try it, we would have to figure out how do we find the dollars because it's additional dollars to that. So thinking about organizational change where you want to change a strategy or diversify a strategy, that's really tough to change midstream, mid swim, unless this is what we started to do too. So I feel like this is a secret I'm about to give people and how to manage their budgets overall. Is what we would do is say, okay, we're going to commit these dollars. We saved X, and then we have Y that would go into additional resources to try to do, to maybe add to strategy and things of that nature. So when I think about how do you change midstream, you finished Q1 up, Q2, you need to see something different. You need to get a different, tap a different candidate pool. You need to try a different resource. You're not getting in what you need. How do you do that? And that comes from plugging away some of the dollars and saying, yes, I realize that we did realize this cost savings because we need to meet the bottom line on the budget, or to meet the bottom line on the budget. But we want to take an extra, or not an extra, we want to reserve X dollars, $50,000 for the year to be able to pilot, trial, those types of things. So I think also when you think about change, how you structure it is really important. And then how you tie yourself into that change and to be able to evolve becomes even more important. So you can ebb and flow with as the world is changing around you.
Right. Right. And I think too, having that's the thing with a lot of the resources that you use in recruiting is that those costs don't always stay flat, and they can grow or reduce based on business performance. So you don't want to lock down too much too soon, because if the market is kind of unstable and you find that your business is falling off, or you lose a big client or something like that, then you don't want to have too many of your dollars already allocated, so that you're forced into paying for a contract that you really don't need. And that's tricky too, because a lot of sites companies don't want you to do that. We know one that wants to force everybody into a 3-year contract. Well, realistically, how many companies really know what their business is going to look like later this year, much less next year or in 2.5 years?
Mhm.
So, it's definitely challenging. And or you want to have some money reserved because, like you said, you want to pilot something that might you may not even be aware of yet, but might come along, and you want to give it a go, see how it performs. Or, if business follows off at the end of the year, it can give you a little cushion so that you don't have to maybe reduce headcount either, because you have a little cushion there that maybe that can help cover some other expenses.
Yeah. 80/20
It's
rule,
definitely
right?
not a simple process. Yeah.
Yeah. I think 80/20 rule, when you think about what am I
Yeah.
locking in,
And the thing is,
80% of
like,
what I need, 20% is more flexible, or 70/30
right,
ideally, but sometimes you just can't get there based on what you need to make sure you have locked down. So,
right. Right. And so, and then in that sense too, especially if you're part of a big organization, you really have to have buy-in across the board, that everybody's willing to sacrifice a little bit here to make the up there, that kind of thing. And that you're all kind of speaking the same language, because what's good for one part of the business may not be good for another part, that
mhm.
sort of.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, you mentioning kind of the 3-year obligation, or three, like people trying to lock you into that, especially when I think about job boards. Going 3 years when you don't know what this is going to look like in some cases. And then they do change, even if they lock you in the 3 year, they're changing the price in between the 3 years. But, anyways, it's a whole other story.
Right.
I
So
digress
when
on
you get
that one.
into year 3, you're like, what is this price doubled?
Yeah, like
Right.
how am I in a 3 year agreement or my price increase? That sounds nuts because you change your structure
Yeah.
yet
Well, and a lot
again.
Well, I remember one of our colleagues that we worked at, at Clover, who was in procurement, and I remember we were talking about, some of these tools and how they wanted to increase the cost year over year, even though we might have been a long-term client. And, especially if we were reducing spend for whatever reason, I remember he made this point to me of like, this site overhauled how they go to market. Is the tool increased in productivity by 20%, or has it, this, that, and the other? And I was like, well, no, not that I'm aware of, and so it's a valid point, because sure, the company has to pay for their resources. They have to pay for people, the salespeople, the people, the implementation, the support, all of that, which, so there can be incremental costs. But if they haven't done anything to help increase the efficiency of the tool or enhance it in meaningful ways, it makes it a lot harder for them to justify major price increases.
Yes.
Although they do, or they're like, well, we have a goal. I remember I had a salesperson tell me, well, we have a goal to increase year over year like 20%. I'm like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's a crazy amount of money, especially when you're talking about, potentially a multi-million dollar budget and they're just one part of it. So if every single one of these vendors wants you to increase by 10 to 20%, if not more, our business has to increase a lot.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
Yeah, and I think when I think about the resources that we utilize in recruiting alone and the job boards and things of that nature, when you have shrinkage, so if you think about what's happened in staffing over the last, I mean, since 2020, really, right? Maybe even before that. When you think about the shrinkage, ideally it comes back. We bring manufacturing back, we increase jobs, and then there's more jobs for staffing to fill. But that industry overall, there you see some growth numbers and projections out there, but some of that's through acquisition to make sure they're keeping themselves whole as they continue to shrink. And then when you think about your traditional, let's say, lid type business, your light industrial business, that's definitely shrunk over the years. So if you're coming in as a resource, let's say you're an Indeed, or people on LinkedIn are not on in lid on LinkedIn professional. But so if you're talking even about
Although,
professional
let tell you
industrial,
otherwise.
right. Anyways, we know the population. So if you're
Right.
talking about, let's just group it in together and say professional and industrial, you're typically reducing your staff, which is going to reduce your tools, and the jobs have gone down, which is going to reduce the number of ads you're putting out there. So to have an initiative, if you're working at a company selling into these companies, to say you have to increase by 20% is bananas bonkers. I'm saying them both because it
It is.
just isn't going to happen. They're going to be looking to cut costs. So then now what you have that's happened in the world of change, in the world of Indeed or wherever, we just don't pick on them. I'm not picking on you. But you have these
It is a
increasing
big
costs to try to keep themselves whole. And it's like you're not doing
right.
businesses any favors. Help, help. That's what we
Right.
needed
Like,
was help.
yeah, exactly. It's a very valid point because I would imagine, I mean, a lot of the companies we've been at, a recruiter might get a new rec, and either they have, it's part of an ongoing process of applying with, constant turnover. And so they probably always have jobs posted out there for that rec or for that particular role. But maybe if they open up a new location or whatever, so they're kind of always putting jobs out there to try to get that candidate and try to attract them maybe from a competitor. Sure, but not all jobs are going to get posted either. They might be on a career site, but a company may not pay an Indeed or another company to actually post them out to the wider web because maybe they don't need to, maybe they can get enough candidates in without having to do that. It sort of seems less that that's happening less now, just from what I've seen, because it seems like there isn't as much proactive recruiting happening as it once was. It's not a situation, I think, where, if you're spending, you know, let's just say $100,000 a month, you can't be thinking that you're going to suddenly spend 120 this time next year without your business incrementally growing. And maybe it is through acquisition, maybe it's not, but acquisitions, as we know, can take years, to implement and to merge those businesses. And there's usually headcount lost and resources blended. So it's not like you acquire a company today and you're really going to see how that impacts your ongoing business for quite some time
Yeah.
too.
Well, I mean, the
So
financials are there
it is,
pretty
it's
immediately. I think that's the
right.
that's the real play, is the financials. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, yeah, it helps with the stock ticker and the board and all of that. But because once you get to a certain size, it's really hard for a company to grow organically without doing acquisitions,
Hmm.
right? Unless you're a company like, like an Apple or something like that, which is always innovating and creating new products. Although, I mean, they even struggle now too, because it's like we were talking about this recently, like how many new phones do you need? When
Yep.
we were first getting Apple phones, it was like soon as a new one came out, everybody wanted to get it. I mean, I remember getting, I think it was like the Apple 3, the iPhone 3, and people were literally stopping me, you know, out places because they'd see me holding it and they're like, "Is that the new iPhone?" And because we were excited about it. That has never happened again. You're going to hold on to it as long as you can, unless you really have a need to change it. So, even though they're innovating, they even have to slow that down because people don't really want to pay $1,000 for a phone either.
Yeah.
So
I remember when I thought like I was the coolest thing since sliced bread with the BlackBerry. It's like I can
I
check
did
my
not
email
like
on
the
this
BlackBerry
thing.
at
I had
all.
back in the day I had the T-Mobile Sidekick. Remember when the flip thing?
Yeah.
I
Oh,
had to get
cool.
the Sidekick was everything. That was the everything. But
Did
when
you
you
have like
think
the
about
pink one? Wasn't there?
yeah, yeah, I loved my Sidekick. I thought yeah, that was
It
the
had like
coolest.
the thing that kind of flipped up
Yeah, it had the screen
and
that
like,
flipped.
yep.
Then you could flip it up, flip it
Yeah.
down, flip it up, flip it down.
Don't you wish you had that now? Wouldn't that be
I do.
cool?
Yeah. Would be neat. Well,
That
that's
would
kind
be
of like when
cool.
they redid the razor. They did the
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and they kind of redid the razor because it's like the nostalgia of the razor.
Right. Yeah, I had a red razor, and I remember Kevin had a razor. Like, yeah, it's crazy because we would ask you about your phone and stuff, and I don't know that anybody else about a phone anymore.
No, because I mean, well, and to your point, like when you think about how expensive they become too, now, I mean, I had the 12 for the longest time, and I just kept running out of space. And that's why I finally upgraded. But I was like, now I got to go into a phone payment again and whatever else because it costs extra and it adds to your bill. And so, yeah, I think people keep things longer, but to the point of, the change aspect of it, you have to keep, I think the key is you have to keep innovating to justify one, the continuation,
Right.
and two, the cost, right? What's the value add overall in order to be able to pay for this change? Because I think about, let's say you don't have business growth. Okay. You stayed flat year over year. And now the cost of we'll just say talent acquisition because it's our world and it's what we're used to. The cost of talent acquisition has gone up, and you're in RPO, and you're in a 3-year contract locked in with XYZ organization. So now in an RPO model, your pricing is guaranteed. It's not based on economic condition. It's not we change your model halfway through. Your price is your price over those 3 years. So now the cost of acquisition goes up and you're utilizing these resources to fill the jobs. Well, if they're innovating and they're doing everything that they need to, right? Ideally, they're reducing your cost. So your cost of acquisition and like a talent marketing goes down. But if it were to go up, there has to be something else that's there to be able to pay for it. Otherwise, you're going to have to let go of that tool and that resource and say, I can't afford it anymore. And then I got to figure out a different way to get what I need in coming in. So I think there's this balance that has to happen between the innovation piece, what's changing, how is it changing, and then how do you work together to be able to do it? And I think that's where, when we see some of the, I don't want to call disdain's not the right word, but when we see some of the resistance, like with the indies, like how staffing has been traditionally treated and things of that nature or priced out, and then there's all this noise surrounding them and someone wants someone to create something different that's going to create that change or replace that product, like that's where it stems from and that's where it drives from is there's not this cohesiveness to say I understand your business, so now let's make sure that you're able to be successful. I think that's kind of what it comes down to too. So
I was just going to say, a lot of times when you're in a partnership with a vendor like that, it doesn't feel like a partnership. It feels like you're being kind of strong armed into something, right? And that's not very helpful. That's
no,
all I
and
wanted to say.
I just remember sitting with, I'll never forget, I was having this lunch. It's when I lived in Vegas, and it was with Career Builder. And it wasn't our longtime person rep who we worked with, who we loved so much. It was someone different that came into the fold. I think they might have left and went somewhere else, the person who we worked with all the time, because we worked with with Gina all the time.
I think I was at this lunch. Was this with the their kind of career builder RPO division?
I think so. And it was at the Paris,
Was
were we
that?
at the Paris
Yeah.
hotel where we had
Yeah, I
the
think it was a pair. Yeah.
outside? Yes. And we're sitting there trying to explain our business model, and it was just falling on deaf ears. Here's why we need it this way. Here's why we need this price. Here's why. And it just kept falling on deaf ears. And I think that's, part of the problem today with what you see with other resources is it's falling on deaf ears when companies are trying to say, hey, this is what I need or whatever else.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times too, it's that situation of some of these companies are really just forcing their salespeople to go out and earn a certain amount of business. And if they aren't getting new logos to their portfolio, because if you have something like a LinkedIn or an Indeed, you there's only so many new businesses that you can get that are going to be sort of in that same category of spend. It's not like you're just going to bring somebody new in who's going to spend at the same level. If I'm saying that right, I'm
Hmm.
trying not to say company names, but if you have a sales rep who's supporting a big client and they're spending millions of dollars every year, you're not going to just pick up a new one by cold calling kind of thing, right? So they're really putting a lot of pressure on those sales reps to continue to grow that business and sort of earn their salary, their commission, all of that. And I understand why that happens, but at the same time, I
Yeah.
I think it's sort of unrealistic, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I just feel like, and we're talking about change in so many different ways, but I think it comes with understanding. Like, really, on one side of the fence, if you're the creator of the change, you have to understand the impacts of that change and what it looks like. And as someone changes and evolves, really making sure you have a good understanding of that and can empathize with it. I think we're also changed fatigue. I don't think that anyone doesn't want to necessarily change or evolve, or like going back from throughout all the examples that we have, that we've been talking about, whether it be you're changing your business model, your structure, your how you're charging people, whatever that looks like, service special that you have as a human, you're changing with technology and your environments and things like that. But I think the understanding and understanding what someone is going through as you go through this change creates a whole lot better world and a whole lot more understanding when you see people who are just they're so resistant to it. Well, it's maybe not because they don't want to change. One, that maybe they don't understand, or two, maybe they're just
Right.
change fatigued and have been through a lot. So I think if we can, whether it's business, it's personal, it's whatever it is, if we can just understand what someone might be feeling, and, you know, I think it would just make it a whole heck of a lot easier.
Right. And because I think ultimately it comes down to that partnership, understanding the company that you're supporting, understanding their business model. Are they making changes? How does that impact them? I mean, as you're talking, I was thinking of multiple examples of where maybe there was a part of the business that was sold off in a different country and they're tied to a global contract. And then you go back to that vendor to say, well, now we have all this extra product because you locked us into a multi-year deal, but we don't even have that business anymore. So what do we do with it? And they're like, eh, you bought it. And it was like, yeah, but only because you forced us to buy it. We wouldn't have bought 3 years in advance unless you had forced us to do it. So I think that's where there's a loss of collaboration and understanding and just sort of, every company is different. And I think sometimes everybody's trying to push everybody into the same sort of pigeonholes. And it's like, we're not all the same size. It's different amounts of business, different scales of people. It's just everything.
Mhm.
It's frustrating because if you're trying to be accommodating to your clients, and then you've got a company that's not treating you like that, it definitely creates a lot of disgruntled clients. I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I agree. At Med Trackers during COVID and being there, right? We had clients in RPO that could not sign up for the cost that we had because full-time workers versus, the travel nursing and contingent looked totally different and they needed to shift their model. So we had minimums in our contracts and we had penalties for those minimums in our contract. And I had to make the decision as a business leader to be able to say, I understand that pain. I get it where you're coming from. So let's renew our deal and I will put this language in for you that says, in terms of this instance, right? Economic conditions, things like that. Put legalese in there to say this
Or,
contract will
or
be null and
by
void, right?
pandemic.
Yeah, and you don't have to, or the minimums are, you know, we'll work within the minimums or things like that. You won't be held for those and be charged for those because it just doesn't make sense and anything can change and evolve. So it caused as a business to say, what's more important? Retaining the client or holding them to this obligation that they signed up for. And then you can stick it to them all you want, but you're not going to make any friends there and you're going to lose the client. So the decision
Right. In the
was,
long run, maybe for short term,
yes,
but you're
right?
not going to keep them in the long term.
Yeah, right. Let's keep it to where we can work together. We're here as a resource. So whatever you want to pick back up, now you're not going to price out my competitors because as soon as you're ready, you can pick right back up where you left off. I wasn't charging you or something you couldn't afford, things of that nature. And let's just pick back up our relationship. It's kind of like, to me, the way I was thinking about it is, when you have that friend that you don't talk to for a year or 6 months or 3 months, and you pick up the phone and you pick back right up where you left off. That's how I wanted to leave
Yeah.
it. I don't know. When you're out of your
Yeah.
slump, you let me know. I'm here for you.
Right. Yeah.
Don't go
Yeah.
to my
Because right
competitor.
now we can work together and make it beneficial on both sides. And then later on, when you need us, we'll be here for you, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I think that's I don't know, a life lesson woven throughout, no matter what it is.
Yeah. So it seems like that's going more out of style in a way,
Yeah.
like it's just not common as it used to be.
Yeah. I feel like it should be more common than it is. All right. Do you want to stop there?
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end.
All right. This episode is sponsored by Social Jobs. Danielle?
Yeah, social jobs, check them out. We'll have a link in the show notes to reach out to them. And don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, share with a friend, comment. We'll love to get the comments going and the conversation. Follow us everywhere that you can follow any podcast on Apple, iHeart, Audible, Spotify, YouTube. We're everywhere.
That's right. We're on all your favorite listening portals. Until next time. Bye.